The very first to speak is Mr. Agramunt from Spain on behalf of the EPP.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I would like to pay tribute to the work done by our rapporteurs, Mrs. Reps, and the colleague from my own political group, Mrs. Pourbet-Lundin. To be clear, I'm with the legitimate government of Ukraine, and I am not with the neo-imperialistic regime in Russia. The domestic government in place right now is legitimate, and there is absolutely no doubt about that. After all, it was backed by 3/4 of the Verkovna Rada, and it has returned to the constitutional spirit of 2004. Ukraine is Europe, and Russia too is Europe. Russia's military aggression in Ukraine was a violation of sovereignty, of territorial integrity of Ukraine, and international legality. The referendum held last month in Crimea was basically cocking a snook at democrats around the world. Russia's occupation of Crimea is unconstitutional and unlawful. It should never be recognised by the international community, and the occupying forces should pull out. I would like to express my support for the independence, sovereignty, territorial integrity of Ukraine, and I would also like to propose some measures for the de-escalation of this problem. First of all, it must be the Ukrainian people who decide on their own future. We must never lose sight of this principle in trying to solve this problem. Secondly, Ukraine has the right to choose its own economic and political entities. I don't see why they can't sign customs unions both with the European Union and with Russia. Thirdly, as far as the Council of Europe is concerned, we must convince all Ukrainians and Russia that a democratic Ukraine with ties to Europe would also nurture the culture, language and history that it shares with Russia. Fourthly, Russia must no longer engage in military actions. It must withdraw its troops from the border with Ukraine. I would like to pay tribute to the domestic government in place right now. It has only been in office for 1 month, and yet it has already approved 80 laws and an important package of economic measures. The constitutional reform must go ahead, the judicial reform likewise, the fight against corruption, and a realistic budget must be approved by the country. The so-called pro-Russian demonstrations that we've seen in Donetsk, Kharkov and Lugansk are fake. They are the embodiment of Russian propaganda, and they have been whipped up by the Kremlin. Recently, I was actually in various Ukrainian cities, including Donetsk, and I could see the demonstrations myself, and I can tell you that these demonstrations were wholly artificial. They were actually carried out by Russian tourists. I think we must speak out against the destabilising movements that Russia has engaged in, with an eye on the elections to be held on the 25th of May. These are unacceptable, and they will only entail further sanctions vis-à-vis Russia. It is also important that parliamentary elections be held very soon, urgently, as soon as we've seen the presidential elections and as soon as the political, constitutional and economic reforms have been put in place. It is unacceptable to adopt some kind of new principle of international law whereby aggression by one country against another in the name of national ethnic protection, that this now becomes acceptable, as in the case of what was done by Russia in Crimea. If we were to universalise this principle, it would be a throwback going back centuries, a new kind of colonialism. As for the president of Russia, Mr. Putin, his behaviour was more typical of the 19th century, and yet he is acting in the 21st century. Looking for national power, for territorial domination, are obsolete ideas, and they have no place in the 21st century. The EU must leave no stone unturned in helping Ukraine find the right solution with customs unions and with a waiver of visa requirements. Thank you very much, Madam President.